A wise man once said, "Handsome fighters never lose battles." That served me well so far, but what happens when the ultimate battle is against yourself? Welcome to Deep Thoughts While Gaming. I'm Chris Chappell. Street Fighter 6 is coming soon, and players of its closed beta are exploring features like a mind-bending character creator and a world tour mode, taking the action onto the streets of global locales. But both changes are just the latest versions of ideas that have always been at the core of the series. And so, to understand the true meaning of Street Fighter, we must first travel back in time to a special moment in history. 1987. Ronald Reagan was urging Mikhail Gorbachev to tear down this wall. Michael Jackson was telling us that he was bad. And women's fashion had reached a new height of elegance and subtlety. Also, the stock market crashed. Good times. Anyway, what also happened was that a strange new video game was unleashed on the world by the Capcom Corporation. When its director came up with the idea for Street Fighter, he was sitting around bored in a meeting imagining a game that would be similar to the walk and punch arcade fighters of the past, but would consist entirely of the hardest and most exciting parts, the boss battles. Street Fighter 1 put you in the role of one of two martial artists, Ryu or Ken, as they traveled the world beating the most challenging foes. Unlike most other games at the time, the characters all had very different fighting styles, from ninjutsu to Muay Thai kickboxing to US-style pugilism by a guy who was definitely not Mike Tyson. The first version of the game was meant to be revolutionary in more ways than one. It introduced a whole new control system in which the strength of characters' moves were controlled by how hard players hit the buttons on the arcade machine. Even some of Capcom's own executives reported injuries and bloodied hands while trying to beat it. It was intense, but ultimately not quite the success the company hoped for. And so, a few years later, they landed on the formula that would make history. The next game would still be hugely challenging, but because of the need to perfect your timing, strategy, and mastery of special moves, not bash your hands against a pad. There would be even more fighters with styles from around the globe, including the first female character to star in my fan fiction. I mean, be playable in a fighting game. And the kickboxing antagonist of Street Fighter 1 was replaced by a demonic Japanese military officer, reinterpreted in the West as a Latin American dictator. The future of fighting games would be decided forever by the events of 1991, when a masterpiece called Street Fighter II: The World Warrior hit the arcades. This often forgotten subtitle of the historic game, in fact, reveals its deeper meaning. It emerged at a time when the Cold War had come to a close, and the US appeared to be the only superpower left standing. Formerly communist countries were turning capitalist one by one, and politicians in the West responded by setting up a new world economic order devoted to one principle above all others: competition. New globalized agreements like NAFTA and the WTO meant that companies from any member country could compete without barriers for customers and profits. Governments promised not to give unfair subsidies or benefits to their own firms, and any company or worker that couldn't keep up would be KO'd, even if they were auto workers in Michigan set up against robots in Toyota factories. No wonder people wanted to smash those cars. I guess it wasn't just for the bonus points. Almost any move was now supposed to be fair in the global arena. If you were losing, that meant you needed to improve your own skills. After all, if the other guy beat you with a Hadouken or a spinning bird kick, that just meant you weren't good enough at deploying your own sonic boom. You shouldn't blame your foes for outdoing you, or your politicians for not stepping in to give you an assist. And you certainly should never blame the market, which was the decider of all value. Looking deeper, the ethos of the globalist order that started in the 1990s was closely tied to the ideas of the Austrian economic and political theorist Friedrich Hayek. He was one of the founders of neoliberal thought, which held that the highest principle of society should be freedom. but not freedom for people to explore and express themselves for personal growth, or with full support of their communities. Instead, Hayek defined freedom as a policy which deliberately adopts competition, markets, and prices as its ordering principles. This was an idea of liberty that even dictators could satisfy, as long as they didn't meddle in the market. And in fact, some of the biggest neoliberal success stories ever were literal dictators, such as Chile's Augusto Pinochet, who brutally crushed all opposition while relying on US economists to help make his country more open to global business. M. Bison would have been proud. And so, in other words, Hayek's freedom just meant battling your foes in a dog-eat-dog world, with no handicaps or special assistance to either side, and definitely no option to cooperate or kiss and make up instead of fight to the death, even with Chun-Li. By late 1991, just as Street Fighter II was dominating the arcades, Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton, a main political proponent of the new globalist order, launched his presidential run. His first speech hit two main points. One, that he was such a dedicated and faithful husband. Two, that he would promise a better life for all who will work for it. Or in other words, a Detroit Union member would now have to hustle like a migrant laborer in Shenzhen, or an electrified Brazilian mutant just to make a living. Even then, there was already opposition to globalist agendas. Not only that, but it came from some on both the traditional right and the left, which had their own reasons to distrust markets as a replacement for communities. In 1992, for example, Clinton's election opponent Ross Perot, a conservative businessman and the most successful third-party candidate for president in a century, condemned NAFTA, claiming that there would be a giant sucking sound as it vacuumed up American factories and jobs. At the same time, labor activists on the left, who were once major parts of the Democrats' coalition, overwhelmingly opposed the agreements, in vain. By the time the WTO had its third meeting in Seattle in 1999, there were massive protests over free trade rules that seemed mostly to benefit the biggest and the strongest. Skepticism grew over time as jobs disappeared overseas and in many cases were not replaced with new ones. Meanwhile, some public intellectuals, like the historian Christopher Lasch, attacked the globalist order on the basis of communitarian beliefs, arguing shared values and stable relationships were vital to human happiness, but were now being abandoned by a revolt of the elites. Those at the top were more obsessed with the progress of overall GDP and their own stock portfolios than with issues like support for working parents or struggling former factory towns. And a big part of the reason was a long-term culture of narcissism that emphasized self-centered goals, achievements, and enjoyment over family or community ties. Of course, the usual establishment response to critics was a cheerful, "Get loose! You can't compete with my powers." But the popular backlash would eventually come back with a vengeance, albeit this time with fewer car-smashing minigames. Keep watching Deep Thoughts While Gaming, and, as another renowned public intellectual once said, go home, be a family man.